On today's show, we dive into the mailbag on a Friday, touching on all kinds of stuff from trading down, Kobe Bufkin, the luxury tax, and more, and all that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1733 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Friday here in early June. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. The place to go is prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for first on deposit match up to $100. Check it out now at PrizePicks. Also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast to make us your first listen each and every day. Check us out and subscribe to Locked On Hawks anywhere you might find podcasts. We are on YouTube on the video side. We are also on Apple and Spotify and Overcast on the audio side. And again, anywhere you might find your podcasts. I appreciate you being here on this Friday. It's been a busy week, as it almost always is in this space. This is our fifth show of the week and plenty to come. I've actually already recorded our next episode, which I will not give too much of that away right now, but it's going to be a two-part NBA draft focus episode. We have more to come on that. And the draft is about 2.5 weeks or so away at this point in time, and plenty to get to. But today's podcast is going to mostly just be mailbag questions, and there's some topical stuff in there as well. There isn't a ton of new news, but I would encourage you to listen to all the other podcasts from this week. I did some mailbag stuff, some rumbling stuff. I had Glenn Willis on the podcast. I had Bill DeFilippo on the podcast talking about the NBA Finals, number one pick stuff. All that's still relevant right now. But without all that out of the way, we can dive into the mailbag on today's podcast. First up, a question from Davis that's certainly relevant right now. I think I heard you mention the Spurs trading 4 and 8 for number one, but not really weighing in on whether the Hawks should do that if it is possible. What do you think about that deal? As far as me mentioning it, I poked some fun at bad aggregation earlier this week when Jonathan Gavoni of ESPN, who's their draft guy, simply just kind of mentioned the Spurs kind of in passing on a podcast about a potential trade up, not even necessarily to Atlanta, but one of those things. And that turned into stuff about how it was reported that he talked about 4 and 8 for number one. That actually didn't happen. So I made fun of that a little bit on the podcast. I will note that today, actually on Friday, Gavoni did write about the Hawks at least exploring trade down scenarios, though he did not tie that to San Antonio. But the Hawks are exploring that. I've heard the same. It's always on the table. We'll have a whole other discussion about that later on in the draft process. But they are going to be looking, I think, at least, I shouldn't say looking, evaluating potential trade down stuff. You know, usually there's the trade down, trade up, stay the same. Obviously, you can't trade up from number one, but they could trade down conceivably. Anyway, the number 4, number 8 for number one thing has been a popular topic because the Spurs are the only team that has 2 picks in the top 10 of this class. Worth noting, the Blazers do have 2 lottery picks, but they're 7 and 14, and 7 and 14 is not going to be enough to get number one even in this class, which I think everybody kind of agrees on. Before I answer the question even more, I should also stress that trade down scenarios do not have to just be for picks in the same draft. I think there are 2 semi-realistic packages involving just picks in this draft. 4 and 8 from San Antonio is certainly one of them. And then also Washington has the number 26 overall pick. So 2 and 26 is probably a realistic thought process for number one overall, potentially. Again, I'm not saying that's going to happen or that it's likely, but it would be reasonable to at least think about that in something in that area. I could also see Washington offering 2 and something else, for instance, to go up by 1 spot. I can see the Spurs offering 4, maybe one of the Hawks' future picks that they actually owe back to the Hawks, rather than using the 8th pick this year. There are different scenarios around there. I can see a bigger deal involving San Antonio, involving maybe one of the guards. That's possible to me. The Rockets have the 3rd pick. I can see them offering number 3 and a future pick or one of their young guys. Detroit could offer 5 and some other stuff, not Kate Cunningham, but basically anything else to go up to number 1. I think all those things are at least in play potentially. I would guess the Hawks don't want to go down too far in this class because I would say they are excited about having a top tier pick in this class, especially when it comes to a future facing package. But there are other possibilities, and it's not just about what picks have sort of currency in this particular draft. But anyway, back to the question. There's been a little bit of digging on this for me. I've made some calls about what this hypothetical, and it is hypothetical, could be. It's not universal or anything, but the majority of folks that I have talked to believe that it would be a pretty good deal for the Hawks to get 4 and 8 for number one. But also the belief is the Spurs probably, not definitely, probably wouldn't offer 4 and 8 for number one in this class. Again, that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. I heard Sam Massey talk about this a little bit on his show, kind of like some skepticism about 4 and 8 being a little bit too much, maybe for number one. But if the Spurs fall in love with one particular player, they do have some incentive to go and get that guy, whether it's Sarr, Risache, etc. They have Wemby. They have extra future picks, of course, from the Hawks in that trade for DeJounte. So they can probably overpay a little bit. I do think that it probably has to be Sarr, Risache for the Spurs to go up to number one, because anybody else, they could probably go up a little bit further, a little bit less than that. I think particularly for Sarr, if they were to fall in love with Sarr, the only place on the board where you can be comfortable that Sarr is definitely going to be there is number one. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's at least possible to me. On the Hawks side, it'd be a little bit tricky, especially if they really wanted a particular player. I've made this point before, but the uncertain nature of this class means that trading back and then also being sure about one player being there is kind of risky. For instance, I have people ask me about Donovan Clingan and trade down stuff, especially today, by the way. Gavoni mentioned trade down scenarios around Clingan potentially because the Hawks like him and maybe don't want to take number one. I get that. I kind of agree. I think Clingan is not your prototypical number one overall pick, but I think in this class it'd be reasonable. And also if you can get him a little bit later, that might make even better sense. I would just say that's pretty obvious to if the Hawks like him that much, to be able to go down a little bit, also get Clingan and get something else would be awesome. But that's obviously just hypothetical. It's hard to project that, though, in a real world scenario. I think you got to be pretty comfortable with more than one player if you're going to move down, 3 spots, for instance, to the Spurs spot. I think if you go to number 2, sure, like obviously reasonably who's going to be available. One guy might be gone, but you have other options. If you go from 1 to 4, that's reasonable to me. But if you want one player, like for instance, if you're just trying to get Donovan Clingan, you better be very, very confident in your intel at 1, 2, and 3, because other teams can go also trade up ahead of you, etc. So it's always a little bit risky, I should say, to trade down that many spots if you're looking for one player. If you're more open to this kind of being a flat class, kind of like I am, because listen, for me, I would be listening to trade down stuff. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but I think because everyone in this class at the top of the board is fairly close together for me, I don't have huge gaps. If you are someone who believes that Sarr is in his own tier or Risache is in his own tier, or whatever, that's different. But if you have a similar tier for all these guys, going down makes some sense in a vacuum. But anyway, everyone views this differently, and I will certainly acknowledge that, and that's not going to change between now and draft night. Question from Alex. I keep hearing everywhere about the players like Donovan Mitchell and Lauri Markkanen and extension talks. Can the Hawks not extend anyone? Why is there not more talk about the Hawks extending players? Well, technically the Hawks have 5 players that will be eligible for some kind of extension in the near future. But without picking on Alex's question, I'm not doing that, I promise. The Hawks have done a lot of extensions recently, actually. They did the Okongwu deal before last year. They did the Bogey extension. Capella got a 2-year extension that was kind of controversial at the time. They gave Hunter a rookie deal a year ahead of time. Perhaps most famously, DeJounte agreed to extension that most people in the league, including me, and even within the Hawks, were kind of surprised by. So that all happened within the last couple of years. So they've been pretty active in extensions. But anyway, there are 5 guys who will actually be extension eligible at some point this summer for the Hawks. 4 guys who are on veteran deals and 1 rookie. So Trey actually could extend at some point beginning in August, and he could add 2 more years at $50 million plus per year. From what I can gather, that's not considered to be likely at all. I think he can wait another year and get a bigger, longer deal next summer if he wants to, but he is eligible. Capella is eligible again for an extension as of July. They could pay him 3 or 4 more years if they wanted to. My appreciation for Clint is well documented, but I think that's not going to happen as far as that long of a deal. It's at least plausible that if they want to hold on to him for a little while longer, they could extend him for less salary, maybe going down because the cap's going up and it becomes more of a amenable salary, but not likely to happen, just at least possible. Garrison Matthews is actually extension eligible if they pick up his team option for next year. They could give him actually a 4-year deal for a bunch of money. They're probably not going to do that, but they certainly could keep him around on a small extension. It wouldn't shock me. And then Bruno Fernando is the 4th guy. He's extension eligible in October if they decline his 2025, 26 team option. That one's unlikely, I would say, at this point in time, but he's at least eligible. And then there's the Jalen Johnson rookie scale extension, which is the one that I've been talking about the most, and I would say is by far the most likely to happen of these 5. We'll talk about this more a little bit later on in the summer, but Jalen could get an extension this summer, as early as July 1, basically. He could agree to that. And it could be all the way up to the 25% max. Now, that's not what I'm expecting to happen as far as the max is concerned, but I am quite confident his reps and his camp basically is going to be asking for a deal that's well beyond $100 million. That's a lot of money. I get that, but Jalen is very good. They like him a lot. And also, it could be as much as a 5-year deal for Jalen. So people have compared his situation to like Devin Vassell last year, Dave McDaniels last year. Might be more than that. But no matter what, I will be sort of fall on the floor shocked if he signs for less than $100 million. And by the way, they don't have to do that. It's the typical will they or won't they between July and October. But no matter what, Jalen will be on his fourth-year deal with the Hawks. Sorry, his fourth year of his rookie contract with the Hawks this coming season. So any talk of an extension will begin the following year. He is locked in for this year, and that'll be a huge topic in addition to the draft and the backcourt and the center spot, all that stuff in between now and the start of camp in October. All right, we'll have more coming up on questions from you, the listener / viewer of this podcast. But first, a word from our friends at PrizePicks. Today's show is brought to you by PrizePicks, and with PrizePicks, you turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game while watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a PrizePicks lineup in less than 1 minute, which is huge if you're busy like I am across the board. All you have to do at PrizePicks is pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you are locked in at PrizePicks. They are America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become a part of the PrizePicks community right now today. The finals mean even more on PrizePicks. Instead of the star players, you can get boosted payouts on select basketball stars you won't find anywhere else. And when the finals are over, the hoops action does not stop at PrizePicks because they have all kinds of women's basketball stuff as well. Just getting started in the WNBA, stars like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese, etc. We're up to 100 times the cash watching them ball out as well. PrizePicks is the best way to get on the action in sports in more than 30 states across the country. That includes Texas and California, as well as Georgia, and they have quick withdrawals as well. You can download the PrizePicks app right now today. Use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for first time deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app. Use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for a first time deposit match up to $100 when you get there. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with PrizePicks. All right, question from Bobby, who says, let's say the Hawks trade DeJounte Murray. Do you think Kobe Bufkin would start at the 2 next year next to Trae Young, or would it be Bogey or someone else? First things first, it would depend heavily on what the Hawks got back in a deal for Murray in this hypothetical. I cut the question down a little bit because it was very long. By the way, thanks for the question for Bobby and anybody else. And by the way, if you want to submit questions, you can do so all over the place. You can send emails to lockedonhawks@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter @BTRowland or @LockedOnHawks on the show. Patreon, 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple will get questions, all that stuff. Send me questions whenever you want to. I definitely appreciate all of that. Anyway, but one more thing that he included was actually hypothetical about Murray and Brandon Ingram and how that might change the answer. All I would say is, if I would say right now with very little information, I would lean to Kobe not being the starter at the 2 on opening night if they move DeJounte. But it is possible that would happen. Not likely, but possible. For one thing, the last thing we saw from Kobe on offense last year wasn't really starter level. I like Kobe quite a bit, but he's not quite there yet. Again, he was a rookie. Rookies are usually not very good, and he also missed a lot of time injury-wise. But there is growth that needs to happen on offense for Kobe Bufkin. Everyone knows that, including him. On one end, it would help him to play next to Trae because he wouldn't have to run the offense. But on the other side of things, he would have to kind of polish up his off-ball game a little bit. But there's stuff beyond that as well. For instance, Bogey is just better than Bufkin right now. And while the Hawks do like Bogey in the bench role, I think he'd probably be more likely to start than Kobe would be on opening night. Also, it depends on what you get back from DeJounte. Like in the Ingram hypothetical, it's kind of tough because ideally you want a little bit more defense between Trae and Ingram than Bogey would provide. But on offense, that would be awesome. Trae, Bogey, Ingram, Jalen in the center is pretty scary on offense, I think. You could get a 2 back in the DeJounte trade as well. You can get a 2 with a mid-level or a trade exception or whatever. So there are options there. You can make trades involving Capella or Hunter or even a Kongwu or whatever to acquire another wing. You also still have Beat Krejci, who's more of a 3, I think, but still could play a little bit of 2 as well. So there are lots of options there. I think a lot of Kobe's value comes from being able to play both guard spots. This is always a hard thing to sell to some people that just want to think about the starting lineup. I am not a starting lineup guy necessarily, but I think a lot of what they saw in Kobe and drafting him at 15, when he wasn't the fifth pick of the draft, he's 15th pick in the draft. So was that he might be a third guard. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but he could be a long-term third guard. And by the way, at 15, that's totally fine if he's good. But a lot of his appeal is that he can play the 1, he can play the 2. And, I can see him kind of be them like this coming season. If they trade DeJounte, like this question is sort of laying out, being the backup point guard and also playing a little bit at the 2 next to Trae. Or even if they trade Trae, keep DeJounte, which I think is less likely, but it's certainly possible. They could have him back up DeJounte, et cetera. So, I think Kobe will play more in year 2. If I had to guess to answer the question, I think he's not likely to start at the 2, but he certainly could, and it would not surprise me if it happened at some point along the way. Question from Mark with a C. Mark says, I've been seeing reports about Zach LaVine being a trade option for the Hawks. To be honest, LaVine's not a player that I follow too much. I know he's coming off of an injury and has a massive contract. Do you have any thoughts on a hypothetical LaVine trade? Not sure it makes a ton of sense unless he's packed with something else and we get to dump some salary in the process. So good question here from Mark. I got probably 5 or 6 things from listeners about LaVine in a short period of time. I was confused by that because there really wasn't any reporting about this, but I went and found a little bit of a fake trade thing online, which I'm sure is where it came from. There's a question also that was similar from AJ, who says the tax concerns basically, but also asked if there's a world where the Hawks could take on LaVine. I want to stress again, there's been no reporting about Zach LaVine and the Hawks. It's all fake hypothetical stuff, but there's nothing wrong with that. Just not a rumor right now. I've referenced LaVine before in this space, but it's been a while. No matter what you think about him as a player, the big thing, as Mark even mentions, is his contract. It's 3 years and almost $140 million left for LaVine. It's a lot of money for a guy with injury concerns. He's not that good. I mean, he's a good player, but he's not like a superstar player. Again, he is quite good. He made 2 All-Star teams in a row not that long ago. In 2021, he was actually pretty awesome. He averaged 27 points a game on really good true shooting, but that's kind of an outlier for him to some degree. Last year, he played 25 games and had foot surgery, so that's kind of the injury concern stuff there. Even before that, he was already like being openly shopped by the Bulls, I would say, and kind of shut down as a result of that. He did have some injury stuff early in his career as well, so it's kind of similar to Brandon Ingram in that he's just not always been particularly healthy. He's been healthy at times and played 60 games a bunch of times, but not a ton of like fully healthy campaigns. Also, last year, while he was not 100%, and you have to keep that in mind, he wasn't that good either. Particularly if you look at his rim numbers last year, they went way down. LaVine is a really good athlete, famously a dunk champion and all that stuff, but as he gets older, not quite the same explosive athlete. He's a good shooter. He's a really talented offensive player, flat out. I won't do a full dive on him right now, but I think he'll be, as long as he's healthy, he's going to be good on offense for a while longer, I would say. But defensively, he has gotten better than he was early in his career. He's taken some real strides. He's still not a great defender by any means. I think he and Trey defensively is not what you would want necessarily. And the big thing is, again, the money. So I'm not saying there's no way you would take on LaVine, but you got to, for me, I think LaVine's contract is underwater. It's not like he's, with guys who are star level players or sub-star level players, they can be underwater and still actually get traded for like positive stuff. I wouldn't be trading like good assets for Zach LaVine if it was me. And given where the Hawks are money-wise, I would be surprised if they acquired Zach LaVine. Maybe, like as even Mark said, like if you take on if they just sent Hunter and whatever else, like Hunter and Capella, I'm not sure what it would be, even salary matching wise, but I think DeJounte is better than Zach LaVine. You could argue Zach LaVine's a better fit with Trey because of what we've seen from DeJounte the last 2 years, and I would probably agree with you on that with Trey on the court. But of course, you don't get the same floor raising with Trey off the floor that DeJounte brings. So I wouldn't trade DeJounte for Zach LaVine. I think DeJounte's on a much better contract. It's like $10 million a year less, and he's a lot more durable, etc. But so that's the thing. Like if you're doing this, you kind of have to be moving DeJounte somewhere else and then trading for Zach LaVine, because I would not swap those two directly personally if it was me. But I could do a deeper dive if this comes up as an actual rumor. But for now, hopefully that answers the question, and I'll leave it there in the meantime. All right, so I will have more coming up in the rest of the show about the Hawks' financial situation, because there's a lot to get to on the luxury tax, salary cap, roster building side. But first, a word from our partners on today's podcast. All right, and before we get out of here, a little bit of a deep dive on the roster situation right now, as well as the cap and financial situations around the Hawks. So I got questions about this. I've teased it a few times about how things have changed. Like basically the question I'm answering on the mailbag here is basically, how does the number one pick impact the money stuff? Because I've referenced it, other people have referenced it. It costs a lot more. And I'll say this now, I'll say it again later. You still want to win the lottery. I'm not ever saying otherwise, but it is more expensive. And given the Hawks' penchant for tax avoidance, that all matters. Anyway, Atlanta has 10 players under guaranteed contract for next year right now. That's Capella and Congo at center. It's Johnson, Hunter, and Gay at forward. It's Bogey and Griffin on the wing. It's Trey, DeJounte, and Kobe at guard. That's 10 players. And they have 2 non-guaranteed contracts. Garrison Matthews, who has a team option, and Bruno Fernando, non-guaranteed. That's 12 guys under contract right now. Then you have 3 guys who are restricted free agents. Sadiq Bey, Vit Krejci, and Seth Lundy. Put those guys to the side right now and come back to it. They have decisions to make on those guys for sure, particularly on Bey, that can impact the cap and taxes is going to be more expensive. I think we all know this, but the Hawks needed to make the roster better and deeper no matter what, coming out of last year's disappointment, particularly at forward, before you even consider the tax or the top pick, etc. Because I said it a lot during the year, but they had 3 guys who were like rotation caliber at forward on the whole roster. That just cannot happen, and I think they know that now. Anyway, to the numbers themselves. The 10 guys I listed earlier that are under contract, fully guaranteed, are due to make about $158.3 million with 10 players. That goes to like 163 with Garrison and Bruno on the team. Now, that may not happen. It's possible that won't happen, but those guys are making just more than the minimum. So, like, you're not getting a ton of savings if you move on from Garrison and Bruno. It'd be basketball reasons why you would do that. Anyway, that is about 8.5, 9 million. I'm trying to be broad on purpose here, under the luxury tax line with 12 players on the roster. Crucially, you have to have at least 14 players, and roster holds still cost money. So here's the thing where it sort of differentiates, but because they won the lottery. At number 10 overall, which is where they were going into the lottery, that pick is going to make about $5.5 million as a rookie, which is real money. But keep in mind here, the number 1 pick is going to make about $12.6 million. So it's a $7 million approximate gap between 10 and 1. So again, it's still great news the Hawks won the lottery, but it immediately added $7 million in pretty much guaranteed salary for next year. It also took the Hawks from below the tax, if they wanted to be like really penny pinching, to above the tax with no other moves at all. Right now, if you just put the number 1 pick on the roster, nothing from Bay, nothing from Krejci, you are over the tax. Again, nothing from Bay, nothing from Krejci or Lundy or whatever, already over the tax line. The tax line's about 171. With the number 1 pick, they're at like 176, and they're still 1 player short at that point in time. So I mentioned briefly on the player capsule I did with Glenn Willis about Sadiq Bey, but it's not a total lock that they offer Sadiq a qualifying offer. I think it's probable. If they do that, his cap hold is like $13 million. It's a lot of money. So he'll cost out on the books until he's either renounced or they sign him for less money. So that's a factor. Veed has a very tiny cap hold, but whatever he's signed for eventually is going to count. Even if it's the minimum, it still counts against the tax. Again, you could cut Bruno or cut Garrison, but you have to fill out the roster. So it might save you like $500,000 total, but that's not a ton of money. So here's the deal in plain terms. This is already the case to a big extent, but it's even clearer now with the extra $7 million that they have on their books with the number 1 pick. The Hawks are going to have to actively cut money if they are mandating that they want to stay under the tax line. In fact, they might be over the first apron line unless they try to cut money. So I won't go down that road right now, but there's under the new CBA, there's the tax line, first apron, second apron. I will tell you this right now. I will fall on the floor if they go in the second apron. There you go. But the first apron, minimal penalty, but anyway, you're still in the tax. And the Hawks haven't been there in a long, long time. So that's the reality. If you're a Hawks fan, I think you should hope that they don't do that as far as cutting salary, because it's not impossible to cut money and improve the roster at the same time, but it's hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard. In the past, I have come on this podcast and said flat out, no caveats, that the Hawks will not pay the tax. The last 2 years before this, I have been A, correct about this, but also B, I've been very definitive that the Hawks are not paying the tax. And I was right. Even if they wanted to hem and haw and mislead and say things that were not necessarily true about it, the Hawks actively cut money 2 years in a row to get under the tax line. That happened. I called that. I said it was going to happen, and it happened. This time around, I'm not doing that, at least right now. I am not saying that they are definitely going to get under the tax line because, number 1, it's going to be harder. Number 2, maybe they're willing. I haven't heard that they're not as willing this time around. Now, there is, I would say, huge skepticism around the league that the Hawks will pay the tax, including from me, to be honest. But every time I talk to someone from a different team or someone in the national media or around or agent or whatever, they almost kind of chuckle about the Hawks paying the taxes. The Hawks were just one of those teams that has not paid the tax for a long time. Now, that could change, especially if they make a splashier move. I don't know what that's going to be, by the way, but it's going to be hard for them to cut. But maybe that changes. Maybe Tony changes his tune this year. It is possible. If he doesn't, they are going to have to do a lot of work to cut money. And it might look like the last 2 years where you trade someone in your top 6 or 7, like Capella or Hunter, for like little money coming back, and that probably makes your team worse. Now, the trouble is they don't have a ton of depth. So while I know not everybody likes Capella and Hunter at this point in time, trading them for nothing, a la what they did with Collins last year, that does make you worse. It just does. Now, the Herter deal is a little bit different. They got a first-round pick in that trade. That's at least more of a selling point than just literally selling a guy for nothing like they did with Collins. But then you throw in Saddiq Bey, who has a very, very complicated free agency with his injury and restricted free agency and match rights and all that stuff. Veet, I don't think is going to get a huge contract, but they might give him some real money this summer, and that adds to the bill as well. You have the decision between Trey and DeJounte, which may not happen. They may not clarify that, but I think they're probably still likely to trade one of them. The center situation, Akon was getting a raise this year, all that stuff. So, as I've said many times before, the willingness to pay the tax is a huge pivot point in the roster building from this summer. And yes, I know that Steve Koonin has gone on the radio multiple times and said that the line that they always say about spending whatever they need to spend. That's been the line before, and they've obviously not fulfilled that. Now, again, and by the way, Steve Koonin is the marketing guy. He's not in the front office as far as basketball decisions are made. Tony Ressler makes the decision about whether they're going to spend this money or not. That is what it comes down to. And I am not advocating for just spending to spend. But like, for instance, we'll touch on this probably a little bit more detail at another time, but they had this trade exception from the John Collins trade that they could take in a player up to $23 million without sending anything back. That's a huge, huge weapon if you will spend the money. But it puts the Hawks further in the tax, and they're probably not going to do that. So flexibility-wise, the big point I want to get across is that, A, they're in the tax right now doing nothing else. Already. Again, with no Bey and no Krejci, already in the tax. B, I am less sure this year that they're not going to go into the tax. But I still am skeptical that they're going to go in. And it's basically, I believe it when I see it kind of thing about whether the Hawks are going to be willing to pay the luxury tax. And that's kind of the feeling around the entire league. Not just from me, who you can say I'm jaded. I get that. People around the league, agents, other teams, media, no one really believes it until it actually happens. And look, I can't tell anybody how to feel about this, but for me, that's kind of how I would put it. I don't want to be a downer because, and this is the reason why I waited a little bit longer to do this little deep dive, because I was asked about it after the lottery because I mentioned it in passing. I'm like, well, I don't want to rain on the parade because it is still a great thing they won the lottery. You still want to have that pick. You have options. You can pick whatever player you want to. You can trade the pick, whatever you want to do. It's a great asset to have in your coffers. But it does add money, and they were already going to be up against the tax, and now they're over it. And it did complicate things as far as the nerdy money stuff, which tends to matter. And trust me, I know that not every fan cares about this. And I don't blame you at all. But in the NBA, you have to care about the luxury tax, about not the tax, but the salary cap limitations, because it impacts everything. In baseball, yes, there's a competitive balance task, but in the end of the day, it's just money. You don't have to match salary and trades. It matters a lot less. In basketball, especially when it comes to salary matching and trades, like deals matter. How much guys make just matters. And whether it should or not is different thing, but it just matters. So anyway, long rambling over about the CBA and the luxury tax and the salary cap. But the Hawks have some real money considerations, money decisions. And if you're a fan, I wouldn't be rooting for the Hawks to cut money because that doesn't matter to me. It's not your money. It's just money in Tony Ressler's pocket. And there's a bit about that as well, but that's how I feel at this point in time. If you have questions, I said it once before, but always send them to me. I will answer some on the show. I will answer some in just reply fashion or whatever. But you can send them to me in a number of different ways. We have an email. It's lockedonhawks@gmail.com. You can send them to me on Twitter @BTRowland or @LockedOnHawks is the show account. You can also leave a 5-star Apple rating. And if you do that, there's a place to leave a review. You can ask a question there. If you are a patron of mine at patreon.com/BTRowland, I'm also taking questions there all the time. And hopefully that is a good place to kind of air this out. I try to do mailbags every once in a while, just kind of empty them out and also just give me something to talk about in certain times, but much more draft coverage to come. I promise you that. In fact, I already recorded one. I already said it at the top of the podcast, but I have several conversations with people lined up for next week. One of them's already recorded, a couple more. Hopefully I'm going to do over the weekend. I'm traveling next weekend, so next week for work. So I'm trying to line up some stuff while I'm gone, but we'll react to any news, any rumblings that are out there. It's a big time for the Hawks. Again, we're 2.5 weeks until the NBA draft. So a good time to go ahead and lock into the podcast. If you've not done it already, please subscribe to the show on Apple and Spotify and Overcast, as well as YouTube on the video side. Likes and comments and subscriptions are appreciated on YouTube as well. It helps us to grow. I'm not a YouTube expert by any means. This is not the most high-tech show in the world, but I'm always told that likes and subscriptions really matter on YouTube. So go ahead and do that as well. And honestly, if you want to help the show, do it multiple times across multiple platforms, Apple, Spotify, downloads, spread the word as well. I know people have found us more and more during this draft season, which is great, but I'm sure you have a Hawks fan friend in your life that you know does not follow this show, and go ahead and pass it to them. Send them a link, share it on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and hopefully they'll join us as well. Thanks for listening, everybody. I really do appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend. I'll be back early next week with more on the Atlanta Hawks, and we'll see you all next time.